Okay, I think we're live. I hope. We'll see. What's up, Dylan?
How's it going, guys? Thanks for coming out tonight, so we appreciate it. Troy and I have been working on getting the slide back and going. My name is Brian Foster. I'm one of the co-founders. We're here with Troy. We've been running Salt Lake Azure Group for about 5 years now. I'm a senior cloud solution architect at Microsoft. And Azure's kind of been our bread and butter since 2014, 15. We've been diving deep into it. And through our journey of into the cloud, we kind of wanted to bring it back to community and kind of help drive that community knowledge and projector, and give that knowledge to others and hopefully bring that developer velocity to the hands of those in the community. But today we have our Troy Philbert is going to be presenting for us on Azure Fundamentals, kind of going over the application development platform. And by all means, feel free to raise your hands, ask questions, interact. We love to have that kind of back and forth ideation kind of process. I don't think we probably only built 2 slides out, and it's going to have a bunch of Visual Studio.
I got like 6, man. I did a lot of work.
We did a lot of work for you guys. Huge honor.
Yeah.
But we also have a lot of demos too, and we can go into. And then also, as we carry out our user groups, we start getting this going. We'd love to have the community be involved in the group. So if anyone feels like you want to kind of be a little vulnerable and come be a presenter, or kind of want to sharpen your knowledge on some technology, the best way to learn it is to present on it. By all means, reach out to Troy and I, and we can get you on the rotation to present it between the two of us. It's kind of long for us. But with that, Troy, I'll let you take this to the stage.
All right, cool. Welcome, everybody. Man, this is a great turnout. And that's a bright projector, so I'm going to stand away. This is awesome to see everybody here. Like Brian said, we ran this for several years, and then we took about a year off because, I don't know, some national thing happened. I can't remember what it was. But so now we're getting back into it again, so I'm really glad to see so many new faces and see everybody here. So today, we're going to talk about Azure Fundamentals. So it's just some of the basic things about Azure. Hopefully it's not too rudimentary for the crowd here. If it is, ask questions, correct me where I need to be corrected, and we'll see if we can learn something together. And we have Brian here. He's like the king of Azure now, so he knows everything about Azure. Yeah. So hopefully he'll be able to answer your questions. So who am I? My name is Troy Philbert. And I always have to assure people that that's my real last name because it's so ridiculous. But that is my real last name. So it's the town in Denmark that my ancestor came from. And it always makes me feel a little dumb because he came to Ellis Island and they didn't use his real last name. They used the name of his town as his last name, and he's like, okay, I guess I'm Philbert now. Whatever, dude. Anyway, so that's where it comes from. Yeah, right. I'm a practice success manager and solution architect here at Software Technology Group. So I deal with a lot of the cloud stuff. I also deal with developers in the Microsoft area and all the scripted technologies and then the cloud stuff. So that's kind of what I do around here. I've been a Microsoft developer since the VB3 days, and most of you probably didn't know that VB went back that far. But there was a VB3, and that's what I started my career in. Actually, I started my career in WordPerfect macros, so that's even worse. But it's been a long time, I guess, is my point. So the first thing I like to do whenever I do a little talk is to talk a little bit about something that's totally off topic, but that I thought was really cool. So the big buzz these days, what's the big buzz of everything right now? ChatGPT, AI, right? All these AI tools that are going to supplant the developer and take over the world. And you know what? I say good riddance. I'm done with it anyway. But until that happens, I've been finding some cool tools that are not ChatGPT, like this 11 Labs. Has anybody heard of 11 Labs before? So let me see if I can get this up. This is amazing. So what 11 Labs is... it's a voice generator. So you can generate a custom voice for your text-to-speech engine, right? And that's cool, right? You can go in and you can set the accent, you can set the language, you can set male or female, the age, you can set all these things. But the other thing that you can do is you can take a 30-second audio clip of somebody speaking, push it into this platform, and it will create their voice that you can use for text-to-speech. So what does that mean? Oh boy, you can have a lot of fun with that, right? You get on the phone and you can say whatever you want in anybody's voice. It's really amazing. And I would show you how that one works, but you got to pay for that feature, and I'm too cheap to do that. But, and I don't know if my audio is going to go through here or not, but let's see. We want to, see, I created an account. Whoops, not that one. That one, I think. Okay, so we'll just do that little bit there. And listen, it is so realistic. When I did a longer piece of text, I couldn't tell that it wasn't a human being. They did the right inflections, they did the right everything. It's truly amazing. And that's just with the free little Rachel voice or whatever. It's really amazing and a lot of fun, and I'm really considering paying for it just so that I can put my voice into it and then I don't have to go to meetings anymore. I just like script something, use ChatGPT to give the answers in your voice. I'm figuring this out. We're going to have fun with this one. Anyway, so I like to show silly things like that sometimes when I do talks.
Misspellings too.
Yeah, but misspellings are fun. Is that what I said? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right. Did it say it correctly? Yes, it did. It doesn't care. It can speak it anyway. That's right. That's right. That's right. Okay. Let's... Caden, could you get on the YouTube and see if it's working for me? Is it working okay? Okay, good. So we're doing a YouTube live stream. This is the first time I've ever done that. So we're going to see how ridiculous it comes out. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Oh, I did want to thank our sponsor, Software Technology Group. So that's where we're at right now. I work for Software Technology Group. Dallin, Christian, Steve, Angie. There's a lot of STGers here. We're essentially a consulting firm. One of the things we consult on is cloud, AWS, I guess, and Azure, right? Everybody loves Azure, at least I do. We do software development, staff aug, and we're always looking to hire good developers. So if anybody's looking for a job, or if anybody's hiring, we help with hiring too. So I just want to throw that out there, give a little shout out to STG. And if anybody is looking for a job, we got Angie on the back row. She's a recruiter. She'd be happy to talk to you if that's something you're interested in. And I've been with STG for almost 20 years, so I know what I'm talking about. All right. All right. Let's move on. Was that me there talking? Oh, okay. Okay, and it is good. See, I bought this brand new lapel mic. This is pretty sweet. I mean, so I'm professional now, so I can walk around and get my exercise while I'm up here talking to you guys, which is awesome. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're just going to go over some of the basic services that Azure offers. We're not going to do a deep dive into Cosmos DB. We're not going to, install a Kubernetes cluster and configure all that. That's another day, some months in the future that maybe somebody else can do for me. Because we're just going to talk about some of the basic Azure native services, right? I'm a big proponent of Azure native services. I like them. There's a lot of value in there. Then we're going to talk about the free options that Azure has. You can do a lot in Azure for free. I host some stuff myself that I do for side projects, and you can do a lot in Azure for free. We're going to look at how to estimate costs, and then we're going to figure out where to go to learn more. So if I'm boring you and you fall asleep, then I won't take it out on you too bad. So what are the three main types of services that we have in the cloud platform? Right? We've got IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. What's IaaS? Does anybody know? Infrastructure as a service, right? What's PaaS? Platform as a service. And what's SaaS? Software as a service, right? We are not going to talk about software as a service at all today. So if that's what you were hoping to learn, you're going to be Sorely disappointed. We're going to talk a little bit about IaaS, but we're going to focus mostly on the PaaS offerings that Azure provides. So let's look at the portal and see what we can do in there. So the portal is where you do a lot of stuff in Azure, right? And the portal is the lowest friction way to get in and play around in Azure, right? Could you imagine if the only way that you could do anything in Azure was through the CLI? I mean, that would be awesome because I love the CLI, but man, wouldn't that be a hard learning curve to AZ create, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now AZ lit. No, that wouldn't be cool. The portal is a really low friction way to get in and create stuff, see what you've got, and do what you need to do. So let's just get into the portal, and we'll look at a couple of the resources that we wanted to talk about. So the first thing, one of the most basic low friction things that you can do in Azure is virtual machines. So virtual machines are just it's like VMware. It's like Hyper-V. Man, I almost forgot what that was called. It's just a virtual machine, right? Virtual machines have a lot of upsides. They make it really easy to lift and shift your on-prem stuff. If you have stuff running on-prem, right, it's really easy to lift and shift that up into a virtual machine because it's just another computer, right? You have something running on here. You have, I don't know, Salesforce or whatever, and you want to run it in the cloud, up into the virtual machine, you can do that. And you can scale them out. You can make availability zones so that they're redundant and they're fault tolerant and all kinds of stuff with virtual machines. And virtual machines are literally the only way that you can do some workloads, right? Some things they need to run on their own hardware. Well, their own machine. There are some downsides to virtual machines, though. Number one is you're responsible for the OS, for all the software patching, all the licensing. For the OS, you can get the license bundled into the monthly charge. But let's say you're running some other software. You're in charge of all of that. When you need to update that Windows server to 20, I don't know, whatever the latest one is, that's your responsibility, and you have to be responsible for that. And so that's a good thing, too, because then you have full control over it, but it's a bad thing because you're responsible for all that. So there's other better ways to do workloads if you have the ability to fit them into the Azure native services, right? Again, sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes lifting it up into a VM is the only way to go. And the other downside of VMs is they're not the cheapest way to do things in Azure, right? I mean, you're paying for a whole VM. There are some cost mitigation things that you can do for VMs. You can shut them down. You can have them auto shut down because you don't get charged for the VM while it's shut down. You do get charged for the storage still, which is, pennies depending on how much you use. So there are some things you can do to cost mitigate that, but VMs are expensive, and you get charged for every second that they run. And the bigger VM you're using, the more money it costs. So there's a lot of better ways to do cloud architecture than using VMs. So if you have the ability to rewrite some of your apps or or build them in an Azure native way, you're going to get better performance usually. You're going to get easier scaling, and you're going to get better cost savings. So we'll look at some of those. So the first one that I want to look at is app services. So we're just going to look at this app service right here. App services are kind of like, well, you can't read that? I can read it just fine. I have no problem reading that at all. I don't know what your guys' deal is. All right. Yeah, thank you, Brian. I'll do that. Is that okay? Everybody see that okay? All right. Still a little more? A little bigger? Okay? Good? Okay. So app services, when I first started in Azure, I kind of thought of them like IIS is a service, right? Everybody loves IIS. Not. But this is a way to host websites, host REST APIs, and all that kind of stuff up here in the app service. And the app service provides a lot of good stuff. You can scale it up really easy. You can scale it out really easy. And so it gives you a lot of elasticity options. in an app service. And one of the other cool things about app services is you can actually run a container in an app service. So if you've containerized all your workloads, you can throw that up into an app service and run it as a container. So if we go in here and we say we want to create a new app service, it's called a web app here. We'll pick our resource group. We're going to give it a name. And like most resources in Azure, this needs to be globally unique in Azure. So nobody else on the entire planet can use the same name that you use. And you can see here, we can do three things. We can do code, a Docker container, or a static web app. And if you pick code, you pick the runtime stack you want, and there's a ton of different runtime stacks that you can set for this. And it'll automatically configure itself to be able to run the code using that runtime stack. So this first couple are really the only ones that anybody should ever use, right? The .NET stuff. But if you're insistent on using an inferior product, no, I'm just kidding. Hey, I like to tease non-Microsoft a lot because Microsoft gets hacked on so much. So I like to give it back a little bit. Anyway, so a lot of different workloads. But you can throw up here and say, I need to do a Docker container. And then you can provide the information for where you're going to get that image, the container registry. And then you can throw a Docker container in here. You can also do a static web app. And static web apps are really good if you're just throwing down some HTML, right? It's not a full app on the back end. It's not going to do a lot of business logic on the back end. You're just throwing down some HTML. So like for Blazor WebAssembly apps, that works really well. For totally front-end apps, you can throw it into a static web app. And you can see you can pick between Linux and Windows. If your app supports it, I would recommend going to Linux almost every time because the cost savings are substantial. Going from memory, I think a basic app service using Windows is, I want to say $33 a month, give or take. That same level in Linux is like $13 a month. So if your workload can run on Linux, you should probably put it into Linux, okay? Which is weird, right? I mean, this is a Microsoft product. You think they'd want to use Windows, but I think Microsoft is going to go Linux the whole way. I think they're going to change Windows 12 to just be Linux.
99% of the Microsoft uses it.
Yep, yeah. Yep. Yeah.
If you run on Linux, we're actually using the subsystem.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works very well. I mean, I run all of my workloads in Linux because everything I do is in .NET 6 and higher, and that runs on Linux, and so I run everything in Linux. Then you select your region. There's a couple of different regions you can pick from. This probably goes without saying, but it's important to select a region that's physically closest to where the most of your users are, right? Because if your users are all in the United States and your region is set up in Japan, well, it's got to go, thousands of miles to get that data every time, and that's just not a good way to do it. So pick a region that's as close to you as makes sense, and then you can do geo-replication and all kinds of stuff for global situations down the line. So then you pick your pricing plan, and when you're just playing around with it, this is my favorite one, the free plan. So this is a service you can get completely for free. Now, is it going to be super performant? Is it going to be what you want for production workload? I wouldn't, but I don't know about you. But this is definitely not a production level. Even the basic, I don't think I would really use for production level. So you're going to want to use one of the premium ones if you're going to production with this. So we can look at that, and you can see the different pricing plans for these. So you're looking at the free one, costs free, which kind of makes sense, I suppose. Basic, you're looking at 12, and so it goes up pretty quick as you get to the higher ones. But yeah, anyway. So that's that. And then you want to set zone redundancy. And in here, you can also set it to automatically set up a deployment from GitHub, right? Which makes it really convenient. You can't do that with the free tier. So if you do a free tier, you can still do deployment from GitHub. It just won't set it up in here. It's all grayed out, and it says, oh, you go into GitHub to do this. We're going to be mean to you and make you do some work. So, but if you pick a non-free one, you can actually set that up here, your repo, all that information. Then every time you push to the main branch, it will just automatically deploy it into here for you. So that's kind of cool. And then you can set it up to connect to a specific network. You can turn on application insights or turn them off. Again, you can't do that on the free tier, right? You can only do that on a paid tier. And application insights is very helpful if you're trying to figure out what's going wrong with an app, because it logs the crap out of everything. And you can see all kinds of stuff in there. Typically, I'll leave that off when I'm playing around, because application insights isn't free. I mean, it costs, and it can get expensive if you're not careful with it.
You can turn it on and off.
You can turn it on and off once you've done it. Yep, this is not a one-time only thing. Absolutely.
It's free up to the first 5 gigs of data retention. Default stores for 60 days. But then you also have your basic logs, your analytic logs. So depending on the type of the logs you want to track, will increase your storage costs.
Yeah.
Depending on the size of your web app and what telemetry you're tracking. So if you're somewhere like, I want all this telemetry for the last 6 months, and this app is used like Netflix, you'll be planning to create depending on storage.
Right. And there are ways you can tweak application insights too to decrease, the amount of data it ingests and all kinds of things. There's things you can do to help mitigate some of that as well. So that's probably a whole other presentation in itself. You can add tags. So I always recommend that people add tags on their resources. Every single resource in Azure can have tags associated with it. And that's just a way to help you organize things, to find things. You can do billing based on tags. There's all kinds of things that you can use tags for. So I like to use tags. And then the next thing is to just create it. And I'm not going to create it because I don't need another free web app in my subscription. Okay. Any questions on app services? They're pretty basic. Most people probably are pretty familiar with those. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is called Azure Container Instances. And Azure Container Instances, again, we were talking earlier about containers, how you can containerize everything, right? Well, on the one end, you've got individual containers running, by themselves, whatever, in Docker for Windows or Docker Desktop or whatever. On the other end, you've got Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes, it's not a trivial pursuit to get Kubernetes running efficiently and doing all the things that you need to do for Kubernetes, right? It definitely has its place. I mean, Kubernetes is amazing, and Azure supports Kubernetes natively through AKS. But there are other options to do containers that are in between those two, right? One of those is Azure Container Instances. And this is a way that you can just throw some containers up into Azure very quickly, very easily, and not have to do a lot of configuration for them. So these Azure Container Instances is best suited for containers that are kind of, self-contained. I guess that's kind of redundant. That don't need to call out to a lot of other resources and stuff like that. Don't need to do a lot of orchestration, right? ACI is really good for containers that are just independent, right? And so in this one, I've got, we're using a tool here called Bookstack. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. It's a way to create books and shelves and stuff like that you can present to end users. And it runs in a Docker container. So I put that in an Docker container instance because all this needs is it needs a container to run the web app. It needs a container to run the MySQL database, and then it just has a little sidecar here. So that's all it uses. It doesn't call out to anybody else. It doesn't do anything like that. It's just a self-contained container group that works really well in Azure Container Instances. So the nice thing about this is you can use all of the Docker commands, Docker up, or Docker compose up. I had a Docker compose file. Ran the Docker compose up on, and there's some things you have to do. We won't go into that. If anybody's interested in that, we can go over that another time. But it's easy to do a Docker compose up. Boom, you've got your Azure containers in there. You can set up volumes that point to Azure storage accounts for your persistent data, right? You don't want to store all your data in the container because once that container restarts, you just lost your entire database. which I wouldn't say that I've done that before, but if I did, it would be really embarrassing. I wouldn't have liked it. So anyway, Azure Container Instances is a really easy way to get some containers up into Azure without having to learn and go into AKS. Now, one thing too is that you can set up the number of processors and stuff you want to use for this, but it doesn't really do a lot of scaling. Like I said, it's just kind of for these things that are kind of self-contained. So then we come down to what we call Azure Container Apps. And so you're probably asking yourself, well, why the crap do we have so many things to run containers? And that's because containers are super popular. And so everywhere you can put the word container, it's going to make you sound cool, right? And so they have Azure Container Apps. And Azure Container Apps, oh, and I wish I would have created one, are kind of the next step above Azure Container Instances. So in Azure Container Apps, you can do some scaling. You can do some container-to-container communication, because Azure Container Apps has native support for this sidecar called Dapr. And Dapr makes it really easy to do service invocation. It makes it really easy to do pub sub like Service Bus or Kafka. It's really easy to do state management using like Redis and stuff like that. So, and I wish I would have created one. I don't have time to do that now. I apologize. But Dapr is a native process inside of an Azure Container App. So if your application is using Dapr, then it's really easy to configure inside an Azure Container App to do all of those kinds of things. So like, for instance, with Dapr, everything's done through configuration. So on your development machine, when you're building your app, right, you could use a local instance of Redis running on a container on your local machine to do all of your pub sub stuff, right? So you publish messages, you subscribe to those messages, right? You don't want to necessarily use an enterprise service bus to do that if you're on your development machine, right? So you can set up your development machine, and it's a configuration file that you tell Dapr, okay, my pub sub is using this Redis on my local machine. Then when you publish that up into an Azure Container App, you've configured your Dapr to know to use Azure Service Bus for your pub sub. So you don't have to modify your application at all. All you do is you deploy it up into your Azure Container App. It says, oh, okay, this is the configuration I'm using Azure Service Bus, and that's going to be your pub sub from that point forward. Okay, so we can do another discussion on Dapr. Dapr is really cool, and it makes it really easy to do a lot of these microservice grunt work, so you don't have to do them yourselves, right? And so the cool thing about Azure Container Apps is that it supports Dapr. It's also scalable. You can set up scaling for it. You can even scale down to 0. And you're probably asking, well, that's stupid. Why would I scale down to 0? That doesn't. But that saves you money, right? If you're not using anything, it saves you money if you're scaled down to 0. So Azure Container Apps is kind of the step right above Azure Container Instances for capabilities. And it's built on top of Kubernetes. And so you get a lot of the stuff that Kubernetes offers without a lot of the complexity. Because again, Kubernetes is not easy. And so this kind of gives you an abstraction on top of Kubernetes that gives you a lot of the great things without a lot of the hard stuff.
Yeah, it's key too. AKS sits in our IaaS, hardware, all that kind of stuff. If you're a developer that knows and uses microservices, you build that way, you're naturally want to go app service, which is a PaaS offering. But then when you do go microservices, what's the next offering? And I think that's the key here is you look on a spectrum between app services being all managed and AKS being all infrastructure. Container apps, right?
Yeah.
Microsoft abstracts all that for you. I built all the hardware, so I can just focus again on my code and what brings our company value to our proprietary software.
And honestly, again, Kubernetes is overkill for a lot of solutions, a lot of workloads, right? It's just more than you need. It'll do it, but it may be more than you need. And if it's more than you need, and you have to train somebody to be a Kubernetes administrator and all that kind of stuff just for a simple workload, it may not be worth it. So there's other options that you can pursue to give you what you need through that. All right. So the next thing on my list is AKS. So AKS is, and I don't have a AKS cluster set up either because those are hard. AKS stands for Azure Kubernetes Services, right? And this is, like Brian was saying, it's the whole Kubernetes experience. So if you're already a Kubernetes expert, this is where you'd want to go. It's all hosted. It's like you said, it's an IaaS. It's kind of a IaaS PaaS mix. Kind of. I mean, you're responsible for a lot of stuff. But yeah, you have the full range of Kubernetes. You can use kubectl to do whatever you need. I mean, it is Kubernetes run in Azure. And again, there's costs associated with this, right? So if you need Kubernetes, by all means use it and make it do the things that it does. If you don't need Kubernetes, there are other options available. And we'll do a presentation on Kubernetes one of these days in the near future. So there's a lot of other PaaS options. One of my favorite PaaS offerings is the Serverless Azure Functions. Has anybody ever used Azure Functions? I think that's my favorite service, and I don't know, it's kind of like your favorite kid. It's hard to pick one, but I have one. I won't tell him because he's one of my kids. I won't tell him which is my favorite because he'll be upset. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, that's right. But I really like Azure Functions because they're so easy to use, so flexible, and you get so much for so little, right? So with Azure Functions, and I've got a few of them here. Let's take a look. If I can remember where I'm going here. So Azure Functions are a totally serverless way of getting a workload into the cloud. And they are, I've heard the phrase infinitely scalable. There's no such thing as infinitely scalable, right? But they scale really good. I think you can have up to 200 instances of an Azure function running at a time. And the thing about that is, with Azure Functions, the ideal is to have them run for a few seconds, maybe a minute. There's a hard time limit of 5 minutes, or you can configure it to 10 minutes. And after that time, it will kill your Azure function even if it's not done. So that's something important to remember. These are really for microservice type things that just you call them, they do some work, and you're done, and they move on. But it's really not, so that 200 is 200 running all at the same time. So if you're doing a bunch of calls and they're only half a second each, you can get a lot of throughput with an Azure function. One of the other beautiful things about Azure Functions is the first 1 million executions of an Azure function per month is free. So if you're not going to do more than 1 million executions a month, then you won't have to spend a dime for all your Azure function stuff. Now, you may have to spend for the database that it's hitting and all that kind of stuff, but you don't have to spend for the Azure function.
Is that per function?
That's per subscription. Yeah, that's per subscription. That would be awesome if it was per function, because you could have a lot of fun with that. Yeah.
Tear that sucker down.
Right? Yeah, put a load balancer in front of them. Oh yeah, you're going to have a lot of fun. Now that is per subscription, but you can have multiple subscriptions too, right? But then you got to balance, is it worth making all the routing and load balancing to save? Because
that's all functions
in the subscription, that's right. However, that being said, functions are extremely cost effective to run. You can run millions and millions of functions for dollars a month. I mean, it really is that cheap. So, for instance, as an example, I built a little app on the side, and I had Azure Functions. And one of the downsides with Azure Functions is if you don't call them a lot, they do tend to go cold. So when you call them again, they have to warm up, right? Which could take a little bit of time. It's called cold start, and it does take a little bit of time. So I thought, okay, well, how can I mitigate this? So I created a timer function that runs in there that kicks off every 5 minutes and just calls something to help keep that function warm. And it actually did work. And I thought, okay, is this going to cost a lot of money? It's going to be about 86,400 calls per month. Is that going to be a lot of money? So I went into the Azure pricing calculator, which we'll look at in a minute, and tried to figure out how much that would cost. It was going to be like 4 cents. So I thought, all right, I guess I can handle 4 cents. And that's assuming I go over the 1 million, right? That was for 1,086,400 instantiations of that function. So I decided a few cents I could handle that. That's probably not going to break me. I didn't tell my wife because who knows what she would say, but I think I can handle that.
I think one thing I like about Azure Functions is I think they're a good candidate for microservices.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Yeah. In fact, I want to show something that kind of leads into some of that right there. But yeah, I love them for microservices. Again, they're not containers, although you can put a container in and run it as an Azure function, right? That's an option. So you can do that, but man, it's really efficient. So let me show you really quick something on an Azure function. So this is Visual Studio. And what I'm going to do, so I've got this Azure function created, and this is what you get right out of the box. When you create an Azure function, this is what Visual Studio builds for you. It's not going to do what I want, but it does something, which is cool, and we'll look at that in a minute. But I did want to show you one thing here. So if I go in and I add a new Azure function, these are all of the different types of triggers that you can use for an Azure function. So the one that I was talking about mostly was an HTTP trigger, right? You make an HTTP call to that Azure function. It's a REST API. To your application, it just looks like a REST API. You make that call, it does something, returns whatever, and you're off to the races, right? It'll do get, post, put, everything. So it's a REST API endpoint. But there's all of these other triggers that you can use, and I can't blow this up. Unfortunately, this doesn't zoom. There's all these other triggers that you can use to kick off an Azure function, and these are incredibly helpful. So you have the service bus queue, the service bus topic, and the queue trigger. And what those will do is if you're using Azure Service Bus or storage queues, then anytime a message comes in, this function will grab that message and go do something with it. So that gives you temporal decoupling on your application. And I love that phrase, temporal decoupling. Doesn't that sound cool? Temporal decoupling? Anyway, so you don't have to do things synchronously. You can send a message, get on with your day, and let something else take that message and finish the work that it needs to do with it, right? So that's what service bus, and we'll get a little bit more into service buses in a minute. So we have the HTTP triggers. Those are your REST endpoints. We have timer triggers. So you can set a function every 5 minutes, go do something. Every 10 minutes, every 3 seconds, whatever you want, you can set a timer trigger to have them go do something on a timed basis. Blob triggers. You can say every time a new file gets put into this storage account, take that file and corrupt it and save it back so that nobody can ever use it again. Right? You can do things like that. SQL input and output binding. So this is fairly new. And honestly, I haven't played with those yet. But if you know much about Azure SQL, Azure SQL is the managed database inside of Azure, the managed SQL Server database, right? It's 98% fully compatible with on-prem SQL Server, but there are some things missing. Triggers is one of those things. So you can't do triggers inside of an Azure SQL database. Well, this is a way that you can do triggers now, is you can set up an Azure function to do a SQL input trigger. So when something changes in a table, you can go do something, and you do that with an Azure function. So we have the IoT triggers. We have, let's see, we've got a bunch in here. SendGrid, so that's for like emails. You got SignalR, you got RabbitMQ, that's another PubSub type thing, Kafka. Anyway, durable functions. So let me talk really quick about durable functions. So like I said before, functions can only run for between 5 and 10 minutes. And it's actually not 100% deterministic either. It might be 5 minutes and 8 seconds. It might be 4 minutes and 52 seconds sometimes. It's not exactly 5 minutes. But the point is, if your Azure function is running that long, you need to refactor it because it's doing something wrong. But we do have durable functions, and durable functions are a way to run long-running processes in Azure functions. And so if you need to do something more long-running, you can use durable functions, and you have to set up an orchestrator that then, calls out to other functions, and it's more complicated, but if you need to do that, that option is available. Okay. Yeah.
So syntax so it's not like so verbose in your code?
Yes. It's been a while since I've done it. There is a way to do it, and honestly I can't remember the exact syntax. But yeah, so when you're doing that workflow, there are ways to short circuit it and that kind of thing so that it doesn't continue on or something like that. Do you know exactly? Yeah.
I'm trying to. And you can wait for all those activities to finish as well.
I'm trying to think if there's a way to do it without actually having to look at the object or to like see. Like basically you can program it in a way that says like if I get this type of response, which is like rejected. Let's say I get rate exceeded, you've hit this endpoint too many times. I want you to go down another workflow without me having to say if response.rate accepted, if that's a status code, basically write it in a way where it does the orchestration without you actually having to define that explicitly.
So you're not supposed to ask questions that I can't answer right away. So I'm a little bit disappointed in you. But
Sure,
like in any error message you get back.
Like any status code, like if you got any status code from any response, basically wiring it up in a way where it knows, okay, I got this response. I know I'm supposed to do this when I get this response. So basically,
So kind of like declarative. You're saying, in this case, do this, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but without having to actually do that.
Write the if statement and whatever.
Because that's an issue that we're having because we're relying on this third-party API that's basically supposed to, we are interacting with that API, and it's a pretty big part of our application. And sometimes, depending on the response that we get back from them, there's certain things that we need to do on our side that we just wouldn't be able to do successfully, or maybe we would want to do some sort of rollback. That's
Right.
Like
Sure.
if I got a bad response from you, then that means some of the data that I programmed to send to you needs to change back to what it was before.
Sure.
And there's a lot of that, and it's not just once or twice. It's like we would run into that scenario quite frequently. So I'm wondering if there's a way with durable functions that we can actually handle that, and that would make it so I could sell durable functions more.
Yeah. You know what? Let me look into that. Let me think about that. And I'll get your information afterwards, and maybe we can get online and chat about that. I mean, another potential would be to do kind of a service bus type thing where, you send things to a service bus and have a function pick that up. If it gets this response, put something in this other topic here that then gets picked up by something else. So durable functions may not even be the way to go. You may be able to do some kind of a workflow like that, right? So that may be something to think about too.
I think it's key too when you look at this dialogue here, the input bindings for these Azure functions is they connect to a lot of other Azure resources. So when you want to do exactly what Troy was talking about, say we pivot from durable function service bus, you still have the logic. You don't need to rewrite a bunch of plumbing.
Yeah,
That's
right.
a big key developer velocity in the cloud right now. Is a lot of this plumbing is handled when you create it. You just say, hey, if I want to do an event hub trigger, you give it the event hub namespace and credentials, and then you still write your same filter logic off into those events and messages.
Yeah.
And you go flow. So it brings that developer off. Realize there's an indenting backbone within Azure resources. The blob trigger, new blobs, a new file is dropped onto storage. I want to go verify it. So you can build a function that says I want to look at this directory, and if a new file is created, let's go and do what I need to do. You don't have to build any of that plumbing. You don't have to start with a scratch, say ASP.NET console application to do it and have this exe and you run. It's all inherently there.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it brings a lot of developer velocity.
And along those lines too, there's another concept that Azure Functions has called output bindings, right? So for instance, at a client that I was at recently, they had data coming into a service bus. And then there were other functions that took that data and did stuff with it. They needed me to take that data and push it down to another Azure function to do something else with that data, right? So the cool thing is I created an Azure function that was service bus triggered, with an output binding to a different service bus, and the only line of code I had to put into the body of that method was a return. Just return the value that came in. It knew how to get the input, it knew how to do the output, and it just started flowing the data over to where it goes. So the output bindings can be super powerful as well and really reduce the amount of code. Because, back in the old days, you'd have to, spin up the service bus, get the SDK and attach to it and all that kind of. You don't need to do that. You just set up an output binding and it passes it right through. So Azure Functions are very powerful and very flexible. And durable functions, again, the thing about any development, right, is there's 10 ways to do the same thing, and so it's just trying to figure out the best way. But I'll think about that durable function thing a little bit too. Any other questions about functions? Probably have to put my glasses on so I could see people better, huh? All right. Okay, well, let's move on from Azure. Yeah, so the HTTP triggered ones, it's just HTTP or HTTPS. The what? IoT. Oh, the IoT?
It's also using a HTTP.
So I think the IoT trigger is MMQT, right? Yeah, MQTT. Yeah, I knew it had an M and a Q and a T in it somewhere. So I think that it uses MQTT for that. So the SignalR trigger is going to use SignalR. Yeah, WebSockets. Yeah. So yeah, it just depends on what trigger you use. But again, it makes it super easy. So for instance, if I let's say I want to do a I don't know. Let's say I want to do a timer trigger, for instance. So the timer trigger. Who understands this? Everybody? Yeah. I always have to Google that to remember how to set it up. I can never. It's like regular expressions, right? I can never remember exactly how it all works. It's stupid. But when you only use it once.
It's right next to cousin.
Yeah, exactly. So you set up a cron expression, and I think Azure cron expressions are a little different than some others. So you kind of have to know it. But anyway, if you do like a queue, it's going to prompt you to enter in the connection string for your Azure queue that you have set up. So here in Visual Studio, it kind of steps you through, and by the time you're done, you have a fully blown Azure function. And the nice thing is, again, we're talking Visual Studio here because that's kind of my jam. When you go to run an Azure function from Visual Studio, it actually spins up an Azure function emulator on your machine. So you can run an Azure function on your machine exactly as it would run in Azure. So this is the Azure function emulator, and you can see it gives you all the endpoints so that you can go test it. You can call those endpoints and it'll work exactly as if it were up in Azure. So that's kind of nice. So you don't have to deploy every time you want to try an Azure function. And in fact, Azure has a lot of these on-device tools that you can use. They have a storage emulator. They have a Cosmos DB emulator. They've got all kinds of these things that you can use to do local development without having to hit. Now, you could probably run a production Azure function like this, but probably not a great idea, right? Because this doesn't scale as well. What's that? This? Oh, that? That's Visual Studio.
I just want to go to the version you defined, right?
Oh, scroll up on it? Yeah. So this adds a lot of stuff. So I picked the Azure, the HTTP trigger with OpenAPI. So it adds all of this OpenAPI stuff. You don't have to have any of this stuff in here. The only thing you really need for an Azure function is this piece right here. And then this is your input trigger right here. So I'm saying this is an HTTP trigger that accepts GET and POST. I never really do GET and POST. I always pick one or the other.
I just want to know about from where version tag is there, right?
Yeah.
From where it is.
So this is the only one that you would have normally. All of these are built for you automatically because of the OpenAPI stuff, right? Yeah. So this is, if you don't add the OpenAPI stuff, you only have this one. And so you could go in there. So if we go into a web browser and we do this one, for instance. Yeah. I'm dumb sometimes. Okay. So it takes you into the OpenAPI test harness that you can, right? I mean, everybody's seen this. You could do I want to try it out. What happened? Okay. I got an okay response. Woohoo! Exciting. So we can put a name in here and execute it. And there we go. So the HTTP trigger function executed successfully. So yeah, and you can do that. I mean, even if it's up in Azure. If it's in Azure, you have to worry about the key. You have to pass in an API key to use it and stuff like that. But it's just baked in. Yeah. So the only code for that whole thing is this. What? It's 48 lines, and half of that is closing brackets. Right. So that's the whole thing right there. Yep. Yep. And it's all based on these attributes that you define, and then the .NET framework takes care of it for you. So.
Same Azure function works for multiple versions of my code.
Yeah.
We can maintain
Multiple versions?
versions.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And Azure Functions don't need to be written in C# either. Azure Functions support Java, I guess, JavaScript, Golang, Python, and PowerShell. You can do Azure Functions in PowerShell, too. So.
You can host, like, so what Troy's built here would be hosted somewhat on like consumption.
Yep.
Back that million executions free, pay for consumption. So say you have like an enterprise event hub that's taking in millions of events a second. So I work with like MGM Entertainment. We're dealing with you have one races coming up. I'll build a system where they're dealing with 5 million entries every 22 seconds and having to build out these events. And so you can host these functions on like a premium plan. And so you can actually set, now you're paying more, now your cost goes back to like an app service plan. There's always functions running, so it's not consumption based. You can have pre-warmed up functions where you rock and roll. I just think of these little lemmings that are sitting there at the event hub, just waiting for these events to be like, I'm ready to roll. You know? And they just start running, they scale out to hundreds of instances, they're doing their stuff. And then, getting back to your kind of flow too. Here's the event, I got to retrack on some stuff, let me go do that, and then you have a flow for that. And then here's a new entry, I have a flow for that, and then they do their thing and they divide the conquer from the event style.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you don't have to run them as consumption, right? You can put them into an app service, and then it's a flat fee every month, and you pay for. It's essentially you're paying for the capacity rather than consumption, and that's a good way to go if you're going to have millions of them going in every few seconds.
You can containerize them and deploy them on premise and you charge later.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Service bus event hub is a little different between messaging and venting ideologies, but this would be like the consumer of that intention.
Yep.
You can use functions or a good mechanism to start built in, like think of like a message board operator back in the day, making calls. Functions are good to that. Hey, it's this type of event, let me go do something. If it's durable and you have a bunch of those activities, then it makes it, you have that recall activity flow or that create new contact flow. But really, you want to think of a function you can play out as kind of a single unit of work. I personally, it's like using the term microservice because I've seen microservices that have been larger than monolithic applications that I built.
Microservice doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, it's kind of very grandiose terminology we like to throw around, but they're great. Like so I think of them as lending workers. Like the worker snaps. I mean, process.
But they get tired really fast, so you can't use them for very long.
Upload a file to a video file from a queue to a media service and do transcode. That's all it does. That one thing really fast.
And that's a good point. I mean, really, functions are supposed to be small, quick. You're not going to do a lot of stuff in a function. You just do some simple operation and move on.
You don't want to do like synchronous third-party calls.
Yeah.
Asynchronous, but hey, here's that call.
Yeah.
That's great to do. You don't have to host a web app or a .NET API, but you have like you get trigger and pull and execute that.
Yeah. So anyway, I love Azure Functions. They're really cool. All right. I apologize, we're just about out of time. I've only got a few minutes, so I'm just going to kind of go through the rest really quick. I tend to ramble. Yeah, so we'll come back next month. I just wanted to touch on databases a little bit. So the database offerings in Azure have grown considerably over the last several years. So if we go into, let's see, if we go into databases, there are all kinds of different native Azure database services that you can use now. So you've obviously got Azure SQL, right? That's the SQL Server offering. And again, it's 98% compatible with on-prem SQL Server. There are a couple things missing. You can't do cross-database queries. You can't do linked servers. You can't do triggers. There are some things. There are ways around those, which are probably better architecturally than linked servers anyway. But Azure SQL is great. There's really cheap options. You can get $5 a month is the cheapest option you can get for Azure SQL, all the way up to $30,000 a month if you need that. And we had clients that use those levels of Azure SQL. And be very careful when you go in to create an Azure database, because when it asks you to pick the tier that you want, there's two ways to do an Azure SQL database, by DTU or by vCore. And the vCores are a little more expensive, but in the drop-down, it shows you the basic vCore, and it says in parentheses, most cost-effective option. That is a flat-out lie, because it is not the most cost-effective option. The most cost-effective is the basic DTU option, because that's $5 a month. My son set one up, and he just picked the most cost-effective option, and he had one of those $50 credit a month things. He ran out of credits within what, like a week? Because it's not it's the most cost-effective vCore option, but it's a little bit misleading. So be careful when you're picking your tier, because you don't want to end up with a surprise. Because I can tell you, Azure is not really excited about refunding money if you made a mistake and set things up wrong. Yeah, Cosmos is a whole nother discussion, right? And Cosmos is one of the options. Cosmos is their NoSQL offering. Cosmos is awesome. They call it planet scale replication. I mean, Cosmos is huge. It's awesome.
Single-digit millisecond replication.
Yeah, exactly, globally. So it's amazing, and if you need it, it's worth the money. If you're building a CD database to track your Def Leppard disks, it's probably not what you want, right? Does anybody know who Def Leppard is other than me? A couple? I'm just kidding. We have Postgres, we have MySQL, we do have MariaDB. So there's a lot of options. Even in the SQL Server space, you've got SQL Server Managed Instance, which is a little bit more compatible than Azure. And obviously, any database you could possibly think of can run in a virtual machine, right? So, but these are all of the Azure database options. All right. I did want to touch on a little bit about what I call the temporally decoupled messaging. There's a couple of options for PubSub. So we have the Azure Service Bus, which supports both queues and topics. And there's a slight difference between those. Topics are a little bit more flexible. You can do a little bit more with those. You have Event Hub, which is really designed for streaming massive amounts of data. So UTA, the local bus company, they use Event Hub to ingest all of the GPS data for all of the vehicles in the entire system. So they have 700 buses, 200 tracks vehicles, all these vehicles sending GPS in all the time. So they use Event Hub to ingest all of that, and then you can attach to that Event Hub using consumer groups to pull that data out and go do stuff with it. Okay. So Event Hub is really good for that. Service Bus is really good for just receiving messages and then processing them later on. We have Event Grid, which is a little bit different. It deals more with eventing things and responding to events that happen. And there's all kinds of different events that you can go to. And then you have storage queues, which is probably the least expensive way to do it, but it's also the least flexible. All right, so there's several options for doing PubSub. And again, as we go throughout the next few years in this user group, we'll do deep dives into all of these different options so that we can really dig into them. Today was just kind of an overview, and I still am going too long. So any questions on that pub sub message queue stuff? Okay. All right. So that's all the things I want to talk about. Let's go back to the slideshow and see if there's anything cool over here. Oh, the free Azure services. Let me look at those really quick. Okay. There's a website that you can go to. Well, shoot. I can't remember where it is. I forgot to bring it up. But there's a whole bunch of services you can get for free. Like Azure Functions is one, App Service is one. And if you create a new subscription with a new account, there's a whole bunch more stuff that you can get free for 12 months. You can get Azure SQL for free for 12 months. You can get some Cosmos for free for 12 months. I mean, there's a whole, if you just Google free Azure services, there's a website that shows you all of the 12-month free ones and then all of the really, really free ones. And there's a ton you can do in Azure that's totally free. Now, it's kind of like, the old drug dealers. They want to get you hooked on it so that you come back and buy more later, right? So you get into Azure, you set up an app service. Oh, this is too slow. Crap, now I got to pay for it, right? And that's how they get you. But they do give you a lot of free, and it's really great to learn with when you do free stuff. Azure pricing calculator. Let me just show that really quick. See, if I wouldn't have had to reboot my machine, this wouldn't have been a problem. That's what I'm going to blame it on. All right, so Azure pricing calculator. If you want to find out how much a workload is going to cost you, this is a very good tool to figure that out. So let's say you want to, I had one in here already. Let's say you're going to need an app service, you're going to need an Azure function, and you're going to need an Azure SQL database. You know that you're going to need that. So then you come down here and you can configure exactly how you want to do that. So you can see a basic Windows app service at a B1 is going to be $54.75. So let's see what happens if we change that to Linux. $13.14. It was even more dramatic than I thought. So you go from $54 to $13. That's a no-brainer, right? Unless you absolutely need, if you're running .NET Framework 4.8, you may have no option. But if you're running anything that'll run on Linux, this is the way to go for sure.
So point that out, that's for 730 hours, right?
Yep.
Per month.
Exactly.
Right? And so that can get even lower if you use some of the
Exactly right.
scaling up
Yep.
and down.
That's exactly right. Yep.
And that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
it can be even cheap.
Yep. You can get that really cheap. And again, there is a free level of this as well.
That's the
This is the B1, so this isn't the free one. This is the B1. But yeah, there's a free level as well.
Just a quick question. Do you think is it possible for them to take some of your data? Because chances are it's not going to only be one instance. If it's an app service or if it needs to scale or something like that. I'm wondering if there would be a way to sort of take some previous data, like when you're actually in the portal, and to have some sort of guesstimate in there, this is what you used last month.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you use a lot. Because I feel like you can make a lot of interesting decisions based on that. You might decide, oh, I actually want to move to some other service in Azure. Maybe you want to, spin up a cluster or do whatever,
So you're saying import this stuff that I'm already using into this and let me tweak it and play with it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there something like
The
that?
Azure App Migration Assessment Tool, which you have access into Azure, which you can actually, if you're thinking of going on-premise to the cloud,
Yeah.
or if you're converting from, say, VMs to PaaS offerings, and potentially have multiple IIS websites on one VM,
Yeah.
you can actually run it and it will monitor network traffic, will monitor a lot of that stuff for you, and let you know, hey, we suggest it's going to be XYZ SKU and instance counts for that. And so you can kind of get that ballpark and realize, hey, we have a client that has 300 VMs, they have over 10,000 IIS web applications right now migrating. How do we get that to pass? What does that look like? And we're actually presenting the same Azure migration, which is in the portal. You search for Azure Migration Assistant in the top search bar from that. And it'll monitor all for you. You can release a PowerShell into 2 that'll open a connection. So for if you have VMs on premise that
Yeah.
That's my goal, is to get rid of all VMs.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
it's there. It's pulled it there.
So that's for on-prem, right?
Go
If you're
on-prem.
migrating from on-prem, but not if you're already in the cloud.
If you're already there, you'll have you have your costs.
Your cost management.
The cost analysis and stuff.
Yeah.
And that application insights, if you're monitoring that multiple times a month, and I don't know who's blind programming, so it's technical too.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's things that a lot of people are like, oh, I want to save SKU, so I'm going to go to standard 1,
Yeah.
the cheapest production level, but I scale out 5 instances. And you realize, well, if I go premium 2, I save some money, I only scale 2 instances, and I still save money.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's some of that as well. And
Yeah.
that is just kind of doing some assessments from your cost analysis.
So this is Azure Functions, right? So you can see that if we go to 1 million, it's still free, right? If we go to 10 million, what is that going to cost us? $1.80 for 10 million.
And sell some STG stock, right?
Yeah, right? So you can see, so if we go to 100 million, I mean, this is 100 million function executions a month, and we're at $33, right? So functions are really cost effective, I guess was my point with that. We got our Azure SQL here. So we're going to do the vCore model. We're going to pick that. We're going to set it to 128 vCores, and we're at $23,000 a month. So if you need that, though, it's probably worth it. Not worth it for me, but somebody it's worth it for, right? So you can go anywhere from $5 to over $20,000.
I was over my net, $86,000 a month.
Yeah, yeah.
Bad queries. You utilize it in any framework in my application.
Well, see, there you go.
Just throw more RAM at it in the cloud.
Isn't that the answer to all development problems? Just throw more hardware at it, right? Throw more resources at it, throw more money.
Troy, just to, it may be obvious to some of us who've been in the cloud for a while, but being able to do something like this and be able to spin up something like a $23,000 a month server, like in the old days, like that could be a 6-month
Yeah,
acquisition and hardware, physical location installation and provisioning and
yeah,
this huge, this whole big process for that, where you can have that up and running
Yep.
in minutes.
minutes.
You can be dragging the sliders.
In fact,
And also you're building.
In fact, one of the big guys at Microsoft, one of the Scots, said one time, he's a sysadmin. He's like, my entire job is turned into a credit card and a button click, right? I mean, you don't need to provision hardware anymore, and this can be dangerous. So you might ask yourself, well, how can I stop this? I don't want some rogue developer going in and setting up some $23,000 SQL Server on accident. Well, that's where Azure policies come in, right? You can go into your Azure subscription. You can set up Azure policies that say, hey, this is the most that anybody can do except for these people. They can only set it up in these regions. You can get really specific with that. And in your production subscription and even in your non-production subscriptions, you're probably going to want to do something like that if you give just anybody access in there. Because could you imagine seeing a bill like this at the end? And like I said, Microsoft doesn't care. They'll take your money happily all day long. They don't care.
30 days after you make the mistake.
Exactly. When it's too late to go back and fix it again, it's like, oh crap, we've got another one coming. So
That's another presentation too. We get into some like I said, Azure policies, infrastructures, code.
yeah,
bridge
yep,
strategy,
yep,
stuff.
yep, yep, yep.
For some companies, making mistakes like that, which is as easy as a slider or a selected drop down, is termination level 2%.
Yeah. All right, let's see what we got next. So these are some good places that you can go to learn more about Azure. Actually, I forgot one super important one on here. The Salt Lake Azure Group, that should be number 1, and I forgot that. I apologize. Microsoft Learn, I really like Microsoft Learn. I use it a lot. They can spin up a sandbox for you so that you can even play in Azure without having to spend a dime. Pluralsight, and then A Cloud Guru is actually a Pluralsight company, and they have, so if you're looking to do a certification, A Cloud Guru is a good place to go because they have practice exams, and they have, I'm doing one right now, and like the first 10 videos were like a minute and a half of explaining what's coming up next. It's like, I don't care about it. So nothing's perfect, but there's some good things. And then there's this tool you may not have heard of. It's called Google. And Google is a way that you can find things. So Google is a good thing. And Bing. Oh, wait. Bing, not Google. Bing. Yeah, get in the chat. Bing has ChatGPT built in. It'll answer everything. It might not be right, but it will give you an answer, I guarantee it.
You gotta speak to Bing nicely.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, at least that's what $10 billion.
Well, just make sure that anytime you ask an AI anything that you're polite, because it might come back at you if you don't, right? Be careful. All right, so if you need to get a hold of me, there's a couple ways to do that. And hopefully, if I didn't screw things up too badly, this will be on YouTube later if you want to watch this again. And we'll be doing these, we're planning on the second Wednesday of the month, every month, forever. And at least until I'm dead or don't care anymore, which might come first. So, but yeah, so thank you for coming. Man, this was a great turnout. I appreciate everybody showing up, and hopefully we didn't bore you so much that you won't ever come back. So thank you very much.
So hopefully as you went through this presentation, at least 10 more questions came up your head and said, I want to learn more. I wonder what that is. We really want to kind of make these presentations custom to those that are coming in and really be of value. So what we would like to do in that meetup or Slag in the comments, please feel free to put in a comment something specific you want to dive into that came to mind. And we're more than happy to come up with presentations more tailored to those specific things.
Yeah, for
I saw
sure.
here in